Situation: Irish loyalists rise up in arms against English rule. Mission: invade Ireland and suppress the Irish uprising. Execution: use cavalry, infantry, and heavy artillery commencing 1649. Administration: the British New Model Army. Command and control: Oliver Cromwell. Welcome to Conquerors. I'm Captain Dale Dye. Like a hidden reef that can mean disaster for a sailing ship, the country of Ireland has often ruined the plans of potential conquerors. However, in the 17th century, one English commander was able to lead his troops to victory in the Emerald Isle. His name was Oliver Cromwell. While he gained fame as a cavalry commander during the English Civil Wars, Cromwell's primary weapon in Ireland was the cannonball, because his enemies tended to disappear behind medieval walls rather than challenge him to combat in open terrain. Now, Cromwell was only in Ireland for less than 40 weeks, but his bloody, brutal campaign cast a long and ugly shadow.
He wreaked such death and destruction throughout the island that his name to this day has become synonymous with a curse in Ireland. May the curse of Cromwell be upon you.
Whenever you travel around Ireland, anywhere you see a ruined castle or a ruined house, and you ask locals who was responsible, they always say, oh, it was Cromwell, even though Cromwell might never have been there, and it probably was destroyed 200 years after his death.
The story begins in October of 1641 as Catholics in the Emerald Isle conspired to throw off English Protestant rule. Ireland had been under the heel of the British Crown for centuries, but in the early 1600s, the Crown instituted a plantation policy that seized land from native Irish Catholics and gave it to English settlers.
Quite understandably, the Irish felt that these English had come in, stolen their land, and they wanted to kick them out.
What we have initially is a revolt by the Ulster native Irish against the Protestant settlement. They also try to seize the city of Dublin, a plan which fails. But this initial revolt in the north of the island very quickly spreads throughout the entire island by 1642.
There was brutality on both sides, and it's estimated that more than 4,000 Englishmen died in the Irish uprising, with a similar number of Irish killed. As tales of the revolt filtered to England, 4,000 dead became 154,000. Protestant propaganda blamed Catholic rebels for the atrocities.
Lurid stories of the excesses of the Irish Catholics, slaughtering people in their beds, using pikes to kill children, driving women into rivers where they drowned, were used to whip up anti-Catholic and anti-Irish hysteria in England, and very successfully.
Englishmen were already prone to view the Irish as savages, so these exaggerated tales fell on willing ears, including those of Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell was a member of Parliament from Cambridge and a fundamentalist Protestant.
Cromwell was not only a Puritan, but he came from the more radical branch of Puritanism. He was a separatist or independent. They thought the Church of England was too far gone to purify. They wanted a separate, independent church. These were the radicals within a radical group.
Cromwell himself showed few signs of future greatness.
He doesn't give the impression of being a gentleman. He gives the impression of being just down from the farm in many senses, uncouth, I think.
He was an ordinary sort of fellow. In fact, the only distinguishing mark he had was a big wart, just here. And there's one occasion when a guy was painting his portrait, and the painter said to him, "Do you want me to include the wart?" And he said, "Yeah. Paint me warts and all." With Cromwell, what you saw is what you got.
The Irish uprising caused a great political crisis in England when the king and parliament disagreed over who should raise an army to quell the Irish. This blew up into an all-out confrontation. The entire kingdom was coming apart at the seams. Within a year, a civil war broke out between royalist supporters of Charles I and radical members of parliament who opposed the king, including Cromwell. He personally raised a parliamentary cavalry troop to fight the king. Cromwell was 43 years old when the Civil War began and had no military training or experience, and yet he was an instant success, rising to become a lieutenant general.
He was just one of those extraordinarily gifted amateurs. He never went to the West Point because they didn't have West Points at the time. But if you look at great generals like a Patton or an Eisenhower or even a Montgomery, these people are not taught. They are great generals because of what's inside them. And Cromwell had that leadership.
With the ordnance, the entire body, there to the enemy's left.
Cromwell brought a peculiar intensity to the field. He could become so filled with nervous energy that he would bite down on his lower lip hard enough to draw blood. The early battles of the Civil War provided a crash course in 17th century cavalry tactics for the inexperienced commander. The standard technique was to keep the horses close together and charge full speed at the enemy. After impact, the horsemen dispersed to chase individual targets, but Cromwell made his cavalry more efficient by training them to keep together after a charge and then circle around and continue the attack.
He rejects many of the old-fashioned ideas of what cavalry generalship is. He learns to use mass and weight in cavalry to charge through or crush the opposition.
We're all familiar with the literary image of a knight in a full suit of shining armor. But by Cromwell's era, that kit had been reduced to something that weighed only about 25 pounds. It included a breastplate, a backplate, and a helmet. Now, a cavalryman like this one would normally carry a brace of flintlock pistols like this. But his most potent weapon was a 3-foot double-edged sword. Now, from horseback, a weapon like this is devastating to infantry on the ground. Not only was he a masterful cavalry commander, but some consider Cromwell to be the father of the British Army. Between 1645 and 1646, he participated in the creation of the first professional standing army in British history, replacing the loosely organized militias in each county with a centralized command structure. This force, known as the New Model Army, was the one Cromwell would use in his conquest of Ireland. Because of their standard-issue red uniforms, these were the first British troops that could rightfully call themselves Redcoats. The well-trained, well-armed, and well-dressed Redcoats turned the tide of the English Civil War. By spring 1646, the King's royalist forces were crushed. Charles I surrendered, and in 1649 he would lose his crown and his head.
It was Cromwell who decided on putting the king on trial and chopping his head off. And that was the most incredible event of the middle of the 17th century. It was one of those events that everyone who was alive at the time remembered exactly what they were doing when they heard the news.
Although Charles I was dead, there was still a strong royalist presence in Ireland. This Irish resistance had to be crushed. It didn't require much convincing to get Oliver Cromwell to lead an invasion. He was eager to get revenge on the Irish.
Cromwell's mindset, I think, was that the situation had become sufficiently settled in England with the execution of the king that it was finally possible to do something that they would have preferred to have done back in 1641. And now that the opportunity was there, he seized it with both hands.
Oliver Cromwell's personal philosophy of war was simple. Find the enemy army, engage them head-on, and destroy them on the fields of battle. It was the impatient strategy of an impatient man.
It was a very hard-hitting, rapid style. If it took a forced march of 40 miles at night to be in position to launch a surprise attack, he would do it.
Cromwell prepared well for his Irish campaign, ensuring that there would be enough money and supplies flowing from England for the duration of the fight. He also did his homework. Know your enemy. It's crucial for any military commander, and it's as important today as it was in the 17th century. If Cromwell was going to destroy the Irish resistance, he first had to know who he was fighting. Irish opposition to Cromwell had united behind Royalist commander James Butler, the Marquis of Ormond. It was an uneasy collection of Irish Catholics and Protestant Royalists called the Confederate Royalist Alliance. Ormond had been the King's Lord Lieutenant in Ireland and was committed to seeing the monarchy restored. Sensing his army was no match for Cromwell's invading force, he adopted a defensive strategy.
But when Cromwell arrives, he's facing a very different type of war. I think he expected to be fighting big battles out in the field. What he actually ends up fighting is a number of isolated sieges as the Confederate Royalist Alliance retreats back into their strongholds and waits for Cromwell to attack them.
And attack them he did. In the coming months, Cromwell's massive war machine would roll across Ireland, leaving not just walls, countless lives shattered in its wake. In August 1649, Oliver Cromwell's conquering war machine arrived from England near the city of Dublin, Ireland. No storm clouds could have been more ominous. In total, Cromwell brought 12,000 soldiers from his new model army to wage the Irish campaign. They were comprised of roughly 4,000 cavalry and 8,000 infantry. A full two-thirds of Oliver Cromwell's new model army was composed of musketeers like this agent. Their primary armament was this weapon, a matchlock. Now, like all muzzle-loading weapons, you put powder and ball in here, ram it home. But there was a difference. This weapon required you to carry a burning match or fuse throughout the course of the battle, difficult in and of itself. To fire it, to launch all of that powder and get the round down range, you were required to prime the pan by placing a small amount of powder in that pan. Close the pan, then load your match into this device, which is called a serpent, or the lock, hence matchlock. Imagine all of this while the enemy is charging at you. Now, the matchlock was so long and cumbersome that musketeers frequently had to use an aiming or support stick, like this one, in order to get any sort of accuracy at all with the weapon. Now, you take a look, got a target, open the pan, aim down range, and hope for the best.
Someone cynically suggested probably about as many people were killed by being hit over the head with the barrel of a musket than were actually killed by the bullets that muskets fired.
The remaining third of Cromwell's new model army was composed of pikemen. Now, these were generally tall and beefy guys, and the reason is they had to handle something like this, an 18-foot spear or pike. They often cut it down in combat so that it'd be more handy in close quarters. Now, pikemen were generally employed in the middle of an infantry formation, and their primary job was to form a screen for those musketeers against cavalry attack. For that reason, they wore armor and a helmet, like this, called a pot then and now. The idea was that that armor would provide protection against musket balls and sword strikes. Cromwell's battle plan in Ireland called for securing the ports along the eastern and southeastern coastline. Once secure, he could move inland toward the capital of the resistance movement,